Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Today we have two wonderful guest lecturers to be able to talk about a very important subject. We're going to be looking into the economics of LGBTQ plus inclusion. It's a very important subject, and I think will be talked about maybe later, that it's maybe not discussed enough, and hopefully will be discussed more in the coming years. We'll have two lectures followed by some Q&A. First, we have Professor Ruut Veenhoven. Ruut Veenhoven is the Emeritus Professor of Social Conditions for Happiness at Erasmus University Rotterdam and an extraordinary professor at Northwest University in South Africa. Veenhoven's current research is on subjective quality of life. Major publications includes conditions of happiness, happiness in nations, greater happiness for greater number. Is that possible and desirable? And Veenhoven has also published on abortion, love, marriage, and parenthood. He is the director of the World Database of Happiness and the founding editor of the Journal of Happiness Studies. Let's please welcome Professor Ruut Veenhoven.
Yeah? This is better. Okay. Well, most of my scientific work is in gathering the results of ongoing happiness research, and that's on a lot of topics. And one of the topics is sexual minorities, and among which transgender. And because my grandson is a trans man, I became particularly interested, and I gathered everything on, well, what is available now on the happiness of transgender people. And actually, I do it together with him. Okay. Well, there's research on transgender people, and the good question always is, why do we do that? Who wants that information? And okay, there is a demand for information, and then we do research on happiness. Oops, what is research on happiness? And only when I've told that, I will review the available findings on transgender people, on the happiness of transgender people, and that's what we know. And then we can also have a look at what we don't know yet. Well, who wants to know about happiness of transgender people? Well, first of all, transgender people themselves, but also organizations and governments. And well, for transgender people, like for any minority, it's interesting to know, well, how do I feel, and do other people like me feel in the same way? And that's one thing. And particularly for transgender people, there is the option, yeah, how should I live? Should I remain in the closet? Should I be open? Should I have a medical transition? And yes, then it's interesting to know what the effects on happiness will be. And that is for transgender people themselves, but also for their family and friends, who support but also advise them. But there's also a big interest in organizations. And in the case of transgender people, there is a strong lobby. Actually, the lobby for transgenders is much more powerful than what I've seen of the lobby of homosexuals in the 80s and the 90s of the past century. And well, as an advocacy group, you want to know how happy these people are. And if they are less happy, which we will see is the case, then you have a point to argue for policy changes. And it's also interesting to know what kind of transgender people are the least happy, and because these should be prioritized in support and in political action. So that's one kind of organizations. The other kind is, well, say the care industry. And the care industry, the medical specialization in treatment of transgenders, well, they're all over Western nations. And what they need is, well, the reasons for their existence. If all transgenders were happier than average in the population, there would be no great need for care. And if you give care, and if that's your business, you must argue that there is a need for care. And once you have the money and you have the facilities to provide care, then the question is, what kind of care is the most effective? And by now, as we will see, the focus is very much on medical care, but we are largely in the dark about people who don't seek medical care, and more life coaching things could be more effective. But whether that's true, that's something we don't know yet. That's what research should tell us. And lastly, governments. Well, governments act only if there is a social problem, or let me say, if the social problem is recognized. For long, homosexuality existed, but it was not seen as a social problem until a strong lobby addressed it. And well, now we have, for instance, in the Netherlands, same-sex marriage. So first, it must be clear that there is a problem. And yes, when there is a problem, then it's also clear that the care should be paid. And that action be taken, that transgenders be accepted, well, which is actually going on. And finally, whether laws should be changed. And for instance, how your gender or non-gender should appear in your passport. Okay, these are the clients of information. Now, a short introduction about research on happiness. That starts with the question, what precisely happiness is. And once you have defined happiness, you can see how that can be measured. And well, once it can be measured, you can do research. Well, and I will show that research on happiness is booming, and that the problem is how to gather all the findings. But first, that tricky question, what precisely is happiness? Well, happiness is a word, and it has a lot of meaning. And that's why poets like the word very much, because you can switch from one meaning to another, and it sounds very interesting. But in the case of scientific research, you better stick to one meaning. And if you search for meanings of the word happiness, let me then focus on the most broad meaning is a good life, quality of life. But when you further think on quality of life, you soon realize that there are different qualities of life. There are chances for a good life. For instance, you being in a nice university and you study being paid by someone. But there are also outcomes of life. Maybe your visit to Rotterdam ends with a drug problem. Good chances, bad outcomes. And there's qualities in your environment, and there is qualities in yourself. Well, you can imagine that gives 4 qualities of life, which sadly have all been called happiness. The chances for a good life embodied in your environment, that is the livability of your environment. And say the least livable is hell and the most livable is heaven. But we're talking about environment. But there are also chances in yourself, which I call life ability. And some people are physically and mentally so strong that they can even survive in the conditions of a concentration camp, which is close to hell. And probably you also know people who are so difficult, so neurotic, that even if they lived in heaven, they would make a mess of their life. We're still speaking about chances. Now, looking at outcomes of life. Well, if you wonder, do I lead a good life? Then one answer is, what does my life contribute to the environment? Well, as a student, that is maybe difficult to answer, but if you're a bit matured like me, you can, well, at least have a plausible story about that. I call that the utility of the usefulness of your life, which is not the same as satisfaction with life, which is the outcome for yourself. You can lead a very useful life, for instance, in academics, writing a lot of books, very useful, but maybe not very satisfying if you never go to the pub and have some pleasure. Anyway, these are 4 meanings of the word happiness, and I focus on happiness in the sense of satisfaction. And that brings us to the next question. What precisely is satisfaction? Again, one word, more meanings. There's passing satisfaction, there's enduring satisfaction, there's satisfaction with parts of life, and satisfaction with life as a whole. And yes, these have all been called happiness. Well, when I speak of a passing satisfaction with a part of life, I call that a pleasure. And a pleasure can be good sex, it can be a good drink, it can even be intellectual. And I hope this meeting will be a pleasure, but it's passing. There's also enduring satisfaction with parts of life. There's satisfaction with your family, with the country where you live, with the weather. And we call that domain satisfaction. And you can be very satisfied with your family, with your looks, with the weather, but still not be satisfied with life as a whole, because there are many things. And if you're dissatisfied with your love life, then your life satisfaction will go down. Well, now I'm already here on life as a whole, and that can also be experienced in passing. That is when you're high, and psychologists call that a top experience. And that is typically passing. Sometimes it lasts longer, but then you're referred to a mental hospital. Actually, the first book on happiness I read when I started in the subject at your age was a dissertation by a psychiatrist about pathological happiness. Yeah, if you're high all the time and feel good, then you do stupid things, and then the family pushes you into a mental hospital. Okay, when we consider what is now interesting to know about happiness of transgender people, that is not whether they have passing pleasures, or whether they get high, or whether they are satisfied with particular domains. No, what we want to know is how much they like the life they live, and their life satisfaction. Okay, so we focus on life satisfaction, and I will also call that happiness. Well, can that be measured? The answer is yes. If you define happiness as how much you like the life you live, well, that's information that is in your head, and you can tap that information by asking people. And a common question is, taking all together, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? Well, and if you're utterly dissatisfied, you say 1, and if you are very satisfied, you say 10. It's a very simple question, and because it's so simple, it has been used in surveys all over the world, and questions like this have been answered several million times. And in this lecture, I will draw on that information. This is one way to measure happiness. Another way is asking people repeatedly, how do you feel right now? And you can do that using a mobile phone. Beep, how do you feel? You tick. And well, in a period of a month, you do that 50 times, and then you take the average. And this is a nice technique, especially if you combine it with a place assignment. And then you can see how people feel, for instance, in this room. Okay, and well, it can be measured, and then there can be research, and research on happiness is booming. You see how, well, the first study was in the more than 100 years ago in an English college, where there was an inquiry on excellence of character, and the professor measured the cheerfulness of the students. Well, you see that there were incidental studies, mostly among students. And so in the 1960s, it starts growing. Actually, I stepped in here in 65. And you see it grows, and it means that, well, this year there will be about 800 publications on happiness. And in order to find these 800 publications, you have to read at least 3,000 of them, because they all use the term happiness, but often in different meanings. Anyway, what we do in the World Database of Happiness, we gather all that research, and then we store the research. And if I click here, you go to the World Database of Happiness. Yes. Here it is, my love baby. We gather all the research on what is called happiness, well-being, and well, each year we read about 3,000 papers. Then we select the ones who are on happiness in the sense of life satisfaction, and we code these by subject. One of the subjects is sexual minority. And then we select the ones that use a proper measure of happiness, which means that from the 800 studies this year, we kick out about half. Well, then we still have 400 studies left. And of these studies, we take out the results. And we describe the results in a standard terminology and in a standard format. And there are results on how happy people are. I will show how happy transgender people are and the things that go together with happiness and the correlates of happiness. For instance, age. Will people get happier when they get older? The relationship, are married transgenders happier than non-married, things like that. Okay. That is the World Database of Happiness. And just to show you some features, here we have the world map of happiness. I can actually show it live. That is nicer than I go back. So I go to reports on happiness in nations, and we have a single nation reports. Well, here, if I go here, you see that Russians are not very happy, but Canadians are, with an average of 7.9. And you see there are a few white spots where no happiness research has been done. Not in Greenland, apparently it's too cold for interviewers to go there. And no happiness research in North Korea, because you know everybody is happy there, so there's no need of. You might want to know how happy we are here in the Netherlands. And you see over the last 10 years, we scored 7.6, which is not bad, but it can be better. The Danes score 8.3, which is higher. So we rank on the position 15, but of a long list of countries, about 160. And here you see the growth of happiness over time. At first sight, nothing changes, but here you see in 65, the average was 7, and in 22, the average is almost 8. So still there is a 1 point rise, but then badly enough, COVID set in, and here you see the COVID dip. Okay, well, this is just to prepare for the real thing, the happiness of transgender people. And well, how many studies are there? And what is the observed level of happiness? And what is the observed effect of transitions? And some observations about correlates. Well, first, the number of findings. If you select in the database findings by people studied, and you click special public, and there you can select on gender, and a subcategory of gender is transgenders. Well, today there are 67 findings. I think tomorrow it will be 70, and if we have another meeting in a year, I think we will have 100, and because the issue is now booming. So if you want to keep track of the studies on the happiness of transgender people or of another sexual minority, here's the way to go. Well, and what do these data tell about how happy transgender people are? Well, clearly they are less happy than the general public. And so in the case of Australia, it's self-identified transgenders about 6.1, and the general public is 7.2, a difference of 1.1. I'd say 11% on a scale from 0 to 10. And you see the same in Poland. And actually in Poland, in the study, they not only compared to the general public, but they also compared to matched controls, people of the same age, but also of the same education and the same social class. And then you see an even bigger difference. Well, this actually, there are more such data, but the message is clear. Transgender people are less happy than other people in the country. At least as shown in research in the past 10 years. And there is now a strong emancipation movement going on, of which this meeting is a part. And I guess that the differences will get smaller. But still, if you compare to homosexuals who had their emancipation earlier, they are still less happy. The difference are not as big as with transgenders, but they still are. And the question is that, well, inherent to a reorientation you must make in your life? Or is it also just a matter of social acceptance? I think both, and the social acceptance may change, but the identity change you make will remain. Okay, and then effects of gender transition. Well, the most data we have are medical transitions, because if doctors give you a sex reassignment operation, they must justify what they do. And so there is a lot of research on medical transitions, but not on the social transitions. And actually only a fraction of transgender people go into medical transition. But okay, that is well documented. And if you go to the data, then you first of all see a difference between a male to female or from female to male. So you see a plus means a positive effect. If it's bold, then it's also significant. Well, if I click here, we go to a finding page in the World Database of Happiness. The World Database of Happiness has 25,000 such pages. And here you see this was a study in Italy on transgender men on hormonal therapy. And here you see T0, that is before this therapy, and T1, that is, when was it? 1 year later. And if you take the lower row, then you see an enormous change. And they gain about 5.6 points, which is really very big. Well, this is just one study, and it's not a very big study, 45 people. So you want to know more. And well, there are other studies which also found significant positive effects. Yes, but there's also one study that found no effect. And here you see that things remain almost the same. There are two slightly different measures of happiness, and in both cases, the difference is insignificant. Well, and that's how research goes. And the more studies you have, and then you can say, oh, maybe this was in this particular population or this particular measure. And so the more findings we have, the better view we get on how these things work. And yes, there is also a long-term study for more than 1 year. And this is a study from 2.5 years later. And they find also a positive effect. Smaller in this case, but on this scale also from 0 to 10, well, almost 4 points. That is, that's really worthwhile. And by the way, this presentation is available, and you can click and go to the pages if you want. So the main message is female to male. Yes, that works out positively with hormone therapy, but not so much for a male to female. Well, and then there's also the gender-affirming surgery, say sex reassignment, and there actually we see a similar picture, less pronounced from male to female, and from female to male, more pronounced. But in the follow-up, we have two studies, and one finds a positive effect, and the other finds no effect. Oh yeah, well, actually, that is the study we saw earlier. But taking all in all, there's no minus sign that people got less happy from the intervention. And then there is, well, correlational studies, and one of the common correlates is age. And it appears that, well, as transgenders get older, they get happier. And that differs a bit from the general public. In the general public, you see a slight U-curve. You're happy when you're a student, and then you get a job, you get a wife, you get children, you have a mortgage. Then happiness goes down, and while you're about my age, then it goes up. For sexual minorities, it's more linear going up. And I think that has to do with, well, gaining more acceptance and finding yourself in the new identity. Then there is openness about transition. And let me show this. So you can be always open, sometimes open, rarely open, or never open. And strangely enough, always open, yes, these are the happiest, but if you see the percent happy, the ones who are never open, 59%. at least in this time in Sweden in 2014, you could also be comfortable with staying in the closet. Well, and if your personality, for instance, if you're born as a male, but you have female personality traits, that you're sensitive and sociable, yes, then you will be happier if you have passed gender transition. And of course, social acceptance will add to happiness of transgender people. Well, so much for what we know. And then interestingly, what we don't know is what most people face, that is actually not the medical transition, but that's the social transition. And that you present yourself as a trans man or woman, that you change your name, that you change your dress, whether or not you join LGBT groups. And actually that is for 80% of the people the most interesting thing, but there's almost no research on that because there's not a business behind. In the medical field, well, if they do sex reassignment operations, yes, well, then you have the people and then you must justify your business by doing research. But here is not yet a vested interest, and it's a task for the transgender groups to make that happen. The only thing we know is about legal gender change, and it was a study in Sweden, and it showed a positive effect. Okay, I'm almost there. Yeah, so what we miss is, for instance, cross-dressing, occasionally or permanent, and all kind of behavioral things. Well, so it's which toilet you use. No research as yet. In conclusion, what we know is that trans people are less happy, that sex reassignment raises happiness, at least at the short term, not always in the long run, but we are in the dark about the very long run. And well, the fact that transgender people get happier with age suggests that they will also get happier after sex reassignment. And of course, they are happier when they feel accepted. And what we do not know is whether people are happier in trans-friendly nations, and in particular, if they will become happier in the next years. And now the issue is so much placed on the political agenda. And we are largely in the dark about the effect of social transitions. We don't know the real long-term effects of medical transitions. And another blind spot is the happiness of non-binary people. And in all these cases, the question is not, does it make you happy? No, the question is rather, what kind of people will get happier and what kind of people not? Because if you go back to the question, why do we do it? Well, we do it also for individuals, and they want to know what will happen to people like me, or actually what has happened to people like me, which I can take into account in making my choices. That was it. Thanks for the attention.
Yes, thank you. Is it on? Hi. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Professor Veenhoven. It was very interesting. For the next speaker, we'd like to find my notes. Yes. So for our next speaker, we have Dr. Chen, who is currently a researcher in economics at the Luxembourg Institute of Socio-Economic Research. Thank you. He is a research affiliate at the Erasmus School of Economics as well. So here at the EUR. He has a wide array of published work. For today, the most relevant is his paper on the well-being and partner dynamics of same-sex relationships and the effects of these concepts and their relation to same-sex marriage. So yeah, would you prefer the microphone or the?
Well, I guess probably can people just hear me directly?
I think it's for the live stream as well.
Okay, cool.
So
Yeah, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to give this presentation. And the topic of my presentation today is effects of same-sex marriage legalization on partnership stability and mental health, which is based on 2 studies of myself and Professor Jan van Noers from the Erasmus School of Economics. So as we know, discrimination against sexual minorities has widely and long existed. For instance, homosexuality had been regarded as a mental disorder even by WHO until 1970s. And in addition to discrimination in the labor market, sexual minorities have been confronted with other kinds of discrimination, such as that in a housing and partnership market. And due to such discrimination and unfair treatment, sexual minorities have suffered more mental health problems than heterosexuals. As part of the structural changes in partnership formations and family institutions around the world, so formal partnerships such as marriage have become less popular, while informal relationships such as cohabitation have been on the rise. And some countries have introduced a registered partnership, which is legally similar to marriage as another type of formal relationship. Moreover, more and more countries in the world have started to recognize same-sex partnership and legalize same-sex marriage. At the same time, societal attitudes towards sexual minorities have gradually improved. And here in this table, you can see the societal attitudes towards sexual minorities around different European countries. So the first 4 columns in the table show the percentage of respondents who answer that homosexuality should never be justified, while the last 2 columns show the percentage of respondents answering that gays and lesbians should feel free to live their life as they wish. And in the table, we observe that societal attitudes towards sexual minorities improve gradually over time, and the Netherlands and Sweden seem to be the most tolerant societies in Europe towards sexual minorities. So despite the structural changes, the symbolic significance of marriage has remained high. So marriage enforces a unique public commitment to a long-term and even lifelong relationship, which is usually expressed in front of families, relatives, friends, and religious clans. And this unique public commitment and its enforceable trust may reduce the transaction costs of enforcing agreements between partners in a couple. Furthermore, marriage has evolved to become a marker of individual prestige and personal achievement, rendering itself distinct from other types of relationships. So in today's presentation, first I will briefly discuss the developments of registered partnership and same-sex marriage in the Netherlands. And then I will focus on the first study about same-sex marriage legalization and partnership stability. After that, I will switch to another study about same-sex marriage legalization and mental health of sexual minorities, and finally conclude. So registered partnership was introduced in the Netherlands on January 1st, 1998. And since its initiation, it has been open to both different sex and same-sex couples. Because in the Netherlands, registered partnership is almost equivalent to marriage in terms of legal rights and obligations. So it has been regarded as an alternative to marriage by many people. And then after being approved in the Dutch parliament at the end of 2000, same-sex marriage was legalized on April 1st, 2001. And it was the first time in human history that same-sex couples were officially and legally provided with marriage equality. So this figure illustrates the annual new formal partnerships in the Netherlands from 1998 to 2018. So here, formal partnerships include both registered partnership and marriage. In the figure, the solid line, the top line, refers to different sex new formal partnerships, and the two dashed lines denote same-sex new formal partnerships by gender. So in the figure, we can see two peaks for same-sex new partnerships. The first peak appeared in 1998 when registered partnership was introduced. And the second peak appeared in 2001 when same-sex marriage was legalized. And then in this figure, we further separate new marriages from new registered partnerships in the same year by different groups. So you can see that you can see a very, very different pattern between same-sex and different sex couples. But for both groups, the number of new marriages, the middle line, dominates the number of new registered partnerships. And this situation is similar between same-sex and different sex couples. So that means marriage still dominates registered partnership. I clicked the wrong button. Okay. So the first study examines how the symbolic significance of marriage affects the stability of formal partnerships. And specifically, we exploit same-sex marriage legalization in the Netherlands as a policy shock to the symbol of marital institution to study the effect of this legislation, as well as the effect of transition from registered partnership into marriage on the stability of partnerships. So we apply a timing of events model to the Dutch administrative microdata to study four things. So first, the transition rate from registered partnership into marriage. And second, the separation risk of registered partnership. Third, whether a partnership became more stable after a transformation into marriage. And finally, we want to know whether there are selection effects from registered partnership into marriage, such that whether more stable relationships were also more likely to transform into marriage or vice versa. So we use the administrative microdata from Statistics Netherlands, and this data include the whole Dutch population registered from 1995 to 2015. So probably all of you are included in my data set. So the individual microdata include personal demographic characteristics, and the marital status data include specific information about entry and termination, as well as the information of the partner in every partnership for every single person in the Dutch registered population. And we identify the individual sexual orientation by comparing one's gender with the gender of his or her partner in every partnership for every person. But in this study, for simplicity, we only focus on heterosexuals, which means people who had only different sex partnerships during this period of time from 1995 to 2015. and same-sex individuals, namely people who only had same-sex relationships during the same period of time, just for simplicity. So in this study, we do not include bisexual people or transgenders, for example. And the unit of our sample is a partnership rather than an individual, because there are always two partners in the same partnership. So we do not want to count the same partnership twice. That's why we only focus on partnership rather than individual. We preserve partnerships starting between 1998 and 2005 and track them for a maximum of 10 years. So this figure illustrates the survival probabilities of same-sex registered partnerships for lesbian women. And the left panel is for registered partnerships established before the legalization. And the right panel is for those starting after the legalization. So in both panels, the solid line refers to the probability of transitions from registered partnership into marriage. So here, the area above the solid line denotes the probability of registered partnership transitioned to marriage. And the dashed line denotes the cumulative probability of transitions from registered partnership to either marriage or divorce. That is to say, the vertical distance between the two lines, the vertical distance between the two lines represents the probability of divorce, okay? So here on the right-hand side, you can see for registered partnerships starting after the legalization, they were much less likely to transform into marriage, but they were as likely to divorce as registered partnerships starting before the legalization. Why? Because after the legalization, these same-sex couples already had the option to marry, so they did not need to enter a registered partnership, then transition to marriage, right? They could just go for marriage directly. That's why we did not see a lot of transitions from registered partnership into marriage for those partnerships established after the legalization. And here, this panel is for gay men registered partnerships. You see the situation is very, very similar to lesbian women. And now this figure displays the survival probabilities of marriages by different couples that started after the legalization. So the solid line is for different sex marriages, and the two dashed lines are for same-sex marriages. So at the beginning, you can see actually different sex marriages were least likely to divorce. So indeed, different sex marriages were most stable. But as time goes by, you can see this line, which denotes gay man marriages. They became most stable, so they were least likely to divorce. But the lesbian women marriages became least stable, so they were most likely to divorce. However, the differences between these three groups is not huge. I will skip the estimation table and just give the verbal results. So in this study, we find that the transition from registered partnership to marriage lowered the separation risk by 68% for lesbian women registered partnerships and almost 100% for gay men registered partnerships. And we regard this effect as the treatment effect of the symbolic significance of marriage, because the only difference between marriage and registered partnership is the symbolic significance, since they are almost equivalent in terms of legal rights and obligations for these two types of relationships. And second, the legalization itself increased the separation risk by almost 50% for lesbian women registered partnerships and almost 200% for gay men registered partnerships. And we suspect that this could be due to the disagreement between the couple about their future marital arrangement. So, you know, after the legalization, one partner preferred to transform their registered partnership into marriage, but the other partner did not want it. So this kind of disagreement may induce the dissolution of their partnership. And finally, we also find that adverse selection dominated positive selection in the transitions from registered partnership into marriage. That is to say, actually we find more stable registered partnerships were actually less likely to transform to marriage, but less stable or more risky registered partnerships actually were more likely to transform into marriage, which is quite interesting and unexpected. And in this table, we also compare the divorce risks between same-sex marriages and same-sex registered partnerships established after the legalization. So the reference group or the omitted group is same-sex registered partnerships. So in the table, you can see same-sex marriages actually had lower separation divorce risks compared to same-sex registered partnerships for both genders. So indeed, same-sex marriages were more stable than same-sex registered partnerships. To sum up, we exploit same-sex marriage legalization in the Netherlands as a policy shock to study the effect of the symbolic significance of marriage on partnership stability. And we find that the legalization increased separation risk in the short term, which is a bad effect. However, it's induced symbolic significance of marriage by the legalization actually stabilized same-sex partnerships in the long term, which is the good effect. And of course, we also find that adverse selection dominated positive selection in the transitions from registered partnership into marriage. Then the second study examines how same-sex marriage legalization affected mental health of sexual minorities. So why do we study mental health? Because according to recent estimates in 2017 worldwide, more than 971 million people suffered mental health disorders. And among them, more than 264 million had depression, and more than 284 million had anxiety. And mental disorders may cause important adverse individual economic performances, such as reducing employment and thus income. So in this study, we apply a difference in differences framework with same-sex marriage legalization in the Netherlands as a quasi-experiment to compare changes in mental health after the legalization between sexual minorities and heterosexuals. And we identified individual sexual orientation just as in the first study with the Dutch admin data. And we examine various dimensions of health and health-related behaviors. And in a second step, we also explore potential mechanisms through which same-sex marriage legalization affected mental health. And these mechanisms include marriage itself, the improved marital stability, which we already discussed in the first study, and the enlarged choice basket of partnership forms for sexual minorities, as well as the improved societal tolerance for sexual minorities owing to same-sex marriage legalization, which I will illustrate in detail later. So the first data in our study, the Pulse Health Survey, also from Statistics Netherlands, is a monthly repeated cross-sectional survey from 1997 to 2009. And in every wave, namely every month, they drew a representative random sample of 700 to 1,000 individuals in the Netherlands, in the whole country. And by following the literature, we focus on the two common mental illnesses, depression and anxiety. And both measures in our study are standardized measures with a mean of 0, average of 0 and standard deviation of 1. So in this figure, you can see that for both indicators, before same-sex marriage legalization, namely April 1st, 2001, we observed a huge gap between the two groups. So the line of circle denotes heterosexuals. Sorry, the line of circles denotes sexual minorities, and the line of triangles denotes heterosexuals. So before the legalization, we observed a huge gap for both mental illnesses. But after same-sex marriage legalization, we see that the two lines almost overlapped for most of the time, which may already provide suggestive evidence that the legalization improve the mental health of sexual minorities. And this data also include individual demographic and socioeconomic characteristics. And the second data in our study is still the micro-admin data from Statistics Netherlands. So the individual data is the same as in the first study. And a new data here is the household micro data. So this data includes specific information about household type, changes in household compositions, and the individual position in the household for every partnership over time. So household type can be single person, married couple, non-married couple, with children or without children. And the individual position can be a single person in a household, or a partner, spouse, parent, child, or even a flatmate. So in this study, we can indeed distinguish a flatmate from a real partner, which is more advanced than previous studies. So we identify the individual sexual orientation in the same way as in the first study. And our estimation sample is simply the combination of the previous two data sets. So the treatment group consists of individuals who had at least one same-sex relationship during our data period from 1995 to 2018. And the corresponding control group is composed of individuals who had only different sex relationships. That is to say, people who had both different sex and same-sex relationships will be classified in the treatment group. So they could be bi people or they could be transgenders. So that's why we name treatment group as the group of sexual minorities rather than the group of same-sex individuals, because the concept is bigger. So in total, we obtained more than 40,000 observations in which the gender is quite balanced. And we have more than 3,500 observations for sexual minorities and more than 10 times observations for heterosexuals. So this table shows the results. The effects of same-sex marriage legalization on mental health. So the first row shows that before same-sex marriage legalization, sexual minorities, so here it should not be same-sex, it should be sexual minorities. So sexual minorities suffered 0.18 standard deviation higher depression and suffered 0.27 higher 0.27 standard deviation higher anxiety than heterosexuals. And the second row shows that the legalization of same-sex marriage did not have any significant effects for heterosexuals. However, in the third row, the coefficient of the interaction of sexual minorities and the legalization show that same-sex marriage legalization significantly decreased the depression by 0.09 standard deviation and decreased anxiety by 0.24 standard deviation for heterosexuals. And then in this table, we also try to discuss about different mechanisms. So how did the legalization improve mental health of sexual minorities? And the first mechanism is marriage, which was impossible for same-sex couples before the legalization, right? So in this table, we simply estimate the effects of same-sex marriage legalization for married sexual minorities and for non-married sexual minorities separately. And you can see in this table that the legalization of same-sex marriage indeed decreased depression more for married sexual minorities than for non-married sexual minorities. But this result does not hold for anxiety. Moreover, the beneficial effects of the legalization for non-married sexual minorities cannot be explained by marriage since they were simply not married, right? So at least part of the beneficial effects of same-sex marriage legalization should be related to mechanisms beyond marriage. And then we discuss the second possible mechanism, which is the improved marital stability owing to same-sex marriage legalization. So in our first study, previously, we already showed that same-sex marriage legalization stabilized same-sex partnerships, right? And there's a large literature documenting the positive association between marital stability and well-being. So this can be the second mechanism. And the third mechanism is the enlarged choice basket of partnership forms for sexual minorities due to same-sex marriage legalization. They could have this extra option of getting married. And this mechanism is especially for non-married sexual minorities. Why? Because even though these people did not enter marriage right after the legalization, they could still enjoy this extra option so that they could enter either type of partnership in the future they prefer. And actually, so we find that after same-sex marriage legalization, not only single sexual minorities crowded into marriage, but also same-sex registered partnerships transitioned to marriage as well. So this may provide some suggestive evidence for this mechanism. And the final mechanism is the improved societal tolerance for sexual minorities or self-perception of being more socially accepted by society among sexual minorities, which has been documented in the literature already. So to sum up, in this study, the second study, we investigate the effects of same-sex marriage legalization on mental health of sexual minorities. We find that before the legalization, sexual minorities suffered more serious mental health issues than heterosexuals. However, the legalization significantly improved mental health of both married and non-married sexual minorities for both genders. And the legalization may take effect by improving the societal tolerance for sexual minorities, as well as stabilizing partnerships and enlarging the choice basket forms for sexual minorities. Moreover, our findings based in the Netherlands may provide a lower bound for less tolerant societies, since in that situation, there will be more room for the improvement of societal tolerance for sexual minorities. And finally, as a typical anti-discrimination policy, same-sex marriage legalization removed the institutional discrimination against sexual minorities by providing them with marriage equality. So our study about same-sex marriage legalization may also provide some implications for the potential beneficial well-being effects of anti-discrimination policies in general. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your presentation. If you can take a seat here, and I did invite Professor Veenhoven to the stage as well, so we can go through some audience questions. Oh, yeah. So we'd also prepared some questions from our side as well. So since we just came out of your presentation, I'd also like this first question directly to your place. When you, sorry. We just talked about same-sex marriage and the legalization. When you, I forgot my question, but give me 1 second. Wait. I'm so sorry. What was my question? I'm drawing a complete blank. I'd like to direct the question then first to Professor Veenhoven. I hope to remember it in 1 second. I'm so sorry. We talked about, I think you get the number of about 70 studies into the happiness of transgender people. So when you compare that to the proportional size of transgender people as like the world population, do you think that's already like an adequate number to sort of do academic research into the subject of their happiness, or is that really just scratching the surface and with the number need to?
It's scratching the surface, and I told her most of the studies are on a very particular group who seek medical transition, and on the most of transgender people, what they do and how they feel, we are still in the dark. But I'm optimistic. There is a strong lobby going on, and it must be possible to raise money for special studies. And I think that sexual minorities will also be included in studies like Paul's and in the European Social Survey. So wait a couple of years and the number of studies will be doubled.
Good to hear. That's good to hear. My question for Chen was, did I still never remember? I'm so sorry. Is there already a question from the audience? Maybe I'll remember in a minute. It was a really good question, so I'm so sorry I forgot it. Yes. There's a microphone coming your way.
Is a question for me or? Okay, thank you. So indeed, there are, especially in recent years, there emerged a lot of studies about same-sex marriage in different countries, especially in the West, including Europe and the United States. But since in the Netherlands and also in Nordic countries, we have super cool data, since we have registered data to very precisely pin down the sexual orientation of individuals. And also we have admin data, which include the whole population of a country. So that's why I think this is the advantage of the studies about sexual minorities and same-sex marriage in the Netherlands and also in Nordic countries. And another advantage is that same-sex marriage was already legalized in Holland in 2001. So you can indeed observe a very long time about same-sex married couples. So that's why we are also quite confident about the data and the evidence we draw from the Dutch data. Thanks.
Thank you. Is there any other question from the audience directed to either of the professors? Yes.
Yeah, well, all I know, there is a difference, and we can just guess what the reason is. And well, one guess could be that society is still male-dominated, and that you better become from female to male than reversely. But it's just a guess. If you have another guess, please tell. You have an. Yeah. Could be. Yeah. Well, this is some of the things we should figure out.
So it's a question for you. So Professor Lee Badge, actually also another Professor Kit Carpenter in University of Vanderbilt, they work on several studies about same-sex marriage in the United States already. So indeed, probably due to the short period of same-sex marriage legalization, I mean, after same-sex marriage legalization in the United States, so US society still did not have tolerant enough attitudes towards sexual minorities. So that could explain part of the differences about probably happiness, life satisfaction, or mental health between Europe and the United States. And they indeed find so improved societal tolerance for sexual minorities could be the biggest driver for the well-being effects in the United States for sexual minorities. Yes.
Thank you for your question. There's another question.
Related to the definition of satisfaction and then happiness, because there's a vast literature that usually refers to the opportunities directly related to the degree of happiness that a person perceives. For example, if you live in a country with a high level of inequality, for example, it's more easy that people experience a lower level of happiness than in more equal countries. So I wanted to understand why to choose the category of outcomes rather than the opportunity or chances one to define how we perceive happiness or how we measure it in a community. Yeah.
Yeah, well, this is a real fundamental question in quality of life research. Should you focus on conditions which you deem good? Well, you mentioned equality, probably you mean income equality. Or do you focus on the outcomes in terms of happiness, health, and how long people live? And the reason why I focus on the outcomes is that we are often unsure about the conditions. For instance, in the case of income inequality, there is no relationship between the level of income inequality in a country and the level of happiness. Actually, in developing countries with high income inequality, people are happier, because the high income inequality in these countries also denotes the chances of improving your life. It's also part of more or less open society. So we tend to overestimate the effect of income inequality. And why do we do that? Because there are strong lobbies that press for income equality. Well, it's the socialists, it's the trade unions, it's typically a topic that is pretty central in policy making, and for that reason it's in the top of the public debate. But its effect on happiness is small or non-existent. And actually the effects on happiness of mental health are far stronger. And the real discussion, if you focus on good outcomes, is not whether the income should be more equally distributed, but if you spend more share of the health budget on mental health than on somatic care. And indeed, there is strong evidence that countries who spend a relative greater share of their health budget on mental health care are much happier. Costa Rica is an example. A country with a modest health budget, but they spend a lot on mental health care, and as a result, they are almost as happy as the Danes are. So in order to correct the common political agenda, we have to look at what the conditions actually do on happiness.
One thing both of you touched on is I think especially in your part, Veenhoven, is the lack of research in certain areas. My questions to both of you: what do you think is the next research that really needs to be prioritized in the collection of data, and also for the follow-up of analysis and studies in these two areas?
Yeah, well, the research typically has some development. First, we focus on the average. And well, actually, you also did that in the case of same-sex marriage. The next question is, who profits most? And of course, also the question of causality. And we start with correlations. But in the case of same-sex marriage, well, is it the happier people who select into marriage? Well, and that requires, more sophisticated research, better data. So it typically takes 10 or more years before we are there. So I would certainly advise you to schedule a next meeting in 10 years. Okay.
Well, I think I totally agree. So actually, as data becomes better and better, then you can, slowly or gradually improve the identification from correlation to causality, as you just mentioned. And also, in order to study the minorities within the minorities, for example, like transgenders, you really need very, very good, precise and large scale data, like admin data from the Netherlands or from Nordic countries like Sweden or Denmark, to pin down the even more minority, like even minorities within the minorities, like bisexual people and transgenders. Yes, so it needs time to improve, and we are also waiting for data scientists to produce more data, more and better data. Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm looking to Jonah, but I think unless there are any more questions, maybe it's time to wrap up. There's one more question. I think we'll make that the final one then.
Thank you. I'm not an economist, so it's difficult to speak in front of you, but I have a question for Chen. You said that marriage gave more stability to relations, especially for men. So why is the relationship of women a little bit less? Is that maybe because they formed already an informal couple for a longer period?
I cannot hear your question very clearly. Can you speak louder, please?
Shall I speak like this? Is this easy?
Oh, you mean the divorce risks between the divorce risks for male same-sex marriages and female same-sex marriages are different. What's the reason? Is that your question? It could be one of the potential explanations because, you know, like indeed, the literature for sexual minorities is already quite limited. And if you even want to investigate the gender differences within this small literature about sexual minorities, it's even more restricted. So there are some papers about like a minority stress, for example. It could be simply due to the ways like how lesbian women and gay men respond differently to different shocks in their life. And another possibility is that, so there are some descriptive studies about open marriages. So they indeed find that open marriages are more common for gay men couples than for lesbian women couples. So if people already have relatively high tolerance for open marriages, and this could be a reason why the divorce risk for gay men marriages is lower than that for lesbian women marriages. But I mean, so far there are no solid research about that, probably due to still data limitation. Yeah. But it's a very, very good question. I mean, it should be something very interesting, exciting to study in the literature. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We have one question from our Zoom call, and maybe that can be the final question. Christina asks, would it be feasible to measure the correlation of communality relations, such as trust, meetings with friends, support from family, with the happiness of a nation, especially in respect to the global South that faces lower GDP per capita, though culturally the community bonding is much higher to northern ones. This was a typo, they're correcting. The correlation of the community of community relations, like how does community relations affect the happiness?
Yeah, well, she should consult the World Database of Happiness because there's a lot of research on the differences in happiness across nations. And yes, well, in rich nations, people are happier. And if nations get richer, people also get happier. And the Easterlin paradox doesn't really apply if you look at the latest data. But the effect of economic growth on happiness is not that we consume more, but economic growth is also paralleled by modernization, by more opportunities, not only opportunities in work, and because the division of labor becomes ever more diverse. And so the more jobs become available for particular kind of people. And because we get richer, also more opportunities are there, even alive without work. So wealth and modernity are typically positively related. But then often the idea is that as we become more modern, we become less social. And the critics of modernity say, well, a modern man is lonely, and life was better in the past when there were more stronger relationships with the neighborhood, with the family, and with the church. Yes, intimate relationships are comforting, but they can also be too comforting. And a typical case is Japan. Japan is a modern society like the Netherlands, but its culture is more collectivistic than individualistic. And there are strong ties. There are strong ties with your family, in the relationship with your parents. Well, you're constantly in debt. They call that on. And the relationship with the colleagues at work are more family-like, and your boss more often meddles in your private affairs than it would be here. It's all very warm and cozy, but it's also suffocating. And that is why actually over the long history, we see a trend of people going from the collectivist, close societies to the more individualized, more free modern societies. And yes, the freedom has its price, and one of the prices is loneliness. But the gain is that in that kind of societies, you can choose a way of life that fits you, whereas in the collectivist societies, the options are much more limited. So in Japan, more people live a life that doesn't really fit them. And they are in a marriage, arranged marriage, that doesn't really fit. They're in the job that their parents chose for them, not the job that they would like. And well, the good thing is that they have less stress of choice. The bad thing is that more people end up in a life that doesn't fit them and that makes them less happy.
Thank you for answering the question. I think that wraps up the Q&A. So I would like another round of applause for Dr. Veenhoven and Dr. Chen. Thank you so much for your time. We prepared a small thank you. We'll give in a minute. But I think otherwise that wraps up this presentation. Thank you all so much for coming. It was really interesting.